going to start out with an invited speaker. Ben Solomon has come to us from the NIH. Thank you for making the effort. Not the easiest thing in the world these days, as you know. Ben is the clinical director at NHGRI, and I happened upon a paper from Ben and Wendy Chung about AI in medical genetics, and I thought, wait a minute, I don't know anything about this. We really need to learn more. So, Ben, take it away. Please give us some education.
All right, I will do my best. I guess, can folks hear me? It sounds...
Yes. Absolutely.
Okay. And if it's also okay, since it's right after lunch, I'm going to move around a little bit just to keep me and all of you awake.
I got you.
You got it? All right.
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Fix that
So here are my disclosures. Perhaps more importantly, here's the agenda. It looks like this is going to be a very well-organized talk, but it's not necessarily going to be. A lot of this is going to weave into itself. But I am going to talk about a lot of the what I would consider hot topics and controversies, and there are a lot of those around AI. To start things, I don't know if are folks familiar with this person at all? Sarah Cooper. She's a comedian. She got moments of viral fame kind of during the pandemic. She did these lip sync things to the president's speeches that were very funny. I think she guest hosted for Jimmy Kimmel or something a couple times. So anyway, before she was a comedian, she worked in tech out west in Silicon Valley, and she has this very funny, I thought funny, day calendar, 100 tricks to appear smart in meetings. And I don't know if you can see this, but this is from my calendar in 2021, and it says, if you want to seem smart in a meeting, just bring up, AI or machine learning. It doesn't matter if you know what it is, just say it, and it sounds kind of fancy. And that was 4 years ago, and now I feel like we hear, perhaps to our detriment, so much about AI and machine learning to the point that many people, I won't ask you to raise your hands, but are pretty sick of it. So when I went to get beer a few months ago at my local grocery store, that was the non-alcoholic choice. I got an alcoholic choice, just so you know. But that was the non-alcoholic choice, is deepfake IPA. Deepfakes refer to fake pictures or videos or things like that. And so I don't know if folks are familiar with this. This is called the Gartner Hype Cycle, and the idea is that any new technology, whether it's an iPhone or genomic sequencing or gene editing or now AI, kind of follows this cycle. And again, I won't ask you to think about, or I won't ask you to say where you think AI falls on this cycle or AI in medicine, but you can kind of, in your mind, think about where we are right now. So, of course, geneticists have been way ahead of everybody else in medicine. Whether or not we knew it, though, AI has been deeply embedded in our practice for many years. So when you see a patient or you're working in a lab and the sample gets sent and the sequencing gets done, there's lots of AI tools, including some really sophisticated AI tools that are embedded in the processes to do things like call variants, to do things like find splice variants. As an interesting aside, a lot of these things, which get published and then get really quickly hoovered up into lab pipelines, are produced by places like Google in this case, and Illumina in that case. And at least at this point, they've been very nice and generous. They're doing a lot of this research. They're making a lot of the code and the data available so that it can be very quickly implemented in both research and clinical pipelines. And then I don't know if folks saw this science paper from just, I believe, a couple weeks ago, where it's kind of a follow-up to Splice AI, where a lot of the regulatory or promoter variants, I think they quote something like 60% of unsolved, what we would consider bread and butter genetics cases will be solved with these methods. And again, we'll explain a little bit about what these mean, but these are all based on AI or deep learning methods. In my mind, there have been kind of two really big deals in the last several years that have really vaunted AI up to the forefront, where folks like us, whether we not like it or not, have to think about it a lot. And I don't know if folks are familiar with this, but this refers to AlphaFold, right? And the folks from DeepMind came up with this. I think as most folks know, but just to review, this is a way to predict 3D protein structures from protein sequences, or maybe the way that proteins interact. You also may be aware that DeepMind, this is a subsidiary of Google, and they brought you, these are the same folks that brought you AlphaGo, so the computer program that defeated someone playing the game Go. And so they named a lot of their things Alpha this and Alpha that. And of course, the Nobel Prize in Chemistry was awarded this year to some of the team that worked on this AlphaFold and some of its subsequent processes. And then that same year, as I think as folks are aware, the Nobel Prize in Physics was given to some of the people that you could say are maybe the godparents of deep learning, of AI, of neural nets, and we'll explain what some of that stuff means. Like with many brilliant people, there are lots of colorful stories about these people. Jeff Hinton, who is perhaps the seminal figure in artificial intelligence, and he's actually one of the people that left one of the leading companies recently because he's very worried about the consequences of it. But he almost didn't survive to adulthood. His father was had a lot of pets and exotic animals, and I think he had some kind of zoo or something like that. He was a herpetologist, studied lizards and snakes, and he almost got bitten apparently when he was a kid by a very poisonous snake, and so almost died. But he made it here to get the Nobel Prize recently. And again, just to underline the fact that these things are constantly changing, this is just a figure from not AlphaFold but Alpha Missense, right? Which is a program that's able to predict the functional consequence of missense variants when they're detected in your patients. And again, what is impressive to me is A, this was not done, sadly, by geneticists, really biologists. This is done by mathematicians and computer scientists. B, this was implemented really quickly. As soon as this came out, folks that worked at the clinical labs, like when you were upstairs listening to someone talking, very, very quickly went from a research paper to actually being used for patients. And C, it keeps coming, and for the sake of time, I didn't put it here, but there's a new version, I think called Alpha Genome or something, that gives you more data about the functional effects of variants. And this, I think, is a big deal too. So how many people recognize, now you can raise your hand, how many people recognize this symbol, this logo? So I'm curious if this is as recognizable, as I've said before, like the Nike swoosh or the Mickey Mouse silhouette. This is the OpenAI or ChatGPT logo. I think it's supposed to represent like a Gordian knot. I'm not sure, but I think so. And this is, as you may have read, was the most downloaded or uploaded or whatever app, and it's used by many tens to hundreds of millions of people just constantly, and just really unbelievably quick uptake of these things. And as one example, so ChatGPT, as you know, is a large language model, can take a bunch of data, can spit a bunch of data out. We'll talk a little bit about how that works. But other large language models, are folks familiar, just out of curiosity, with this one, Open Evidence? So it's a large language model. I see a lot of nods. One of the nice things about this one is that you can get references and citations from it. But this is a real a screenshot from two clinicians. I will not tell you who the clinicians are. I will not tell you what specialty they are, but they're not geneticists. I'll reassure you with that. But just the fact that these are already used, and in this case, one doctor in a hospital was unable to get a consult from another doctor, not a geneticist, but they were able to get really good recommendations from Open Evidence, and then when they compared them to what the internal medicine doctor said, they said, oh yeah, Open Evidence was honestly much better and explained things better, and it all matched. And anyway, so I'm not saying that's a good or a bad thing, but just amazing how quickly this is happening. All right, so I'm going to spend a little bit of time kind of boring you to tears with this, because I just want to, after that introduction, I want to make sure that we're all on the same page about what some of these definitions are. So when all these terms are being thrown around, that we know what they mean. So artificial intelligence is what the name implies, like artificial, fake, a non-carbon-based thing, usually it means a computer, is doing something that seems smart, that seems clever. It doesn't mean it actually is smart, but it seems smart. And this term was coined back about, I believe, 1956 at this summer conference on computer science or something like that. I can't remember the exact name, up at Dartmouth College, up in New Hampshire. They spent several months, working on this definition. And I think it's a funny contrast. And maybe we should all go back to this whole summer of conferences versus a couple of days in lovely Asheville. But anyway, so for years and years, the leading type of AI, what was called rules-based, or sometimes called symbolic AI. So imagine that you have to program a self-driving car. You would have to basically write down all the different rules that the car would have to follow to be able to be a self-driving car. So you'd say things like, okay, car, if you're going up to the intersection and there's this red octagonal thing there, you should stop, you should scan across the intersection, and if there are no people and no cars coming, then you can carefully proceed forward. But imagine if you programmed that down in North Carolina and that self-driving car went up to Maine and all of a sudden a moose walked across the intersection. If you hadn't explicitly said, hey, if there's this giant hairy animal with antlers or horns or whatever you call them, sorry, I'm not sure, you should stop also, right? So you have to, it's a silly example, but you have to program everything pretty explicitly to get what you want. But for decades, that was the leading type of AI. And imagine that you were trying to teach a computer to do something complicated. Your job was to spend years writing every single scenario down. And after decades of that, that was supplanted by machine learning, which is, as the name implies again, the machine, the computer is learning. And there's different ways a computer can learn. One of the simplest ways to think about it is what we call supervised learning. So let's say you have a bunch of pictures of moose and a bunch of pictures of elk. You label the moose, these are moose. You label the elk, these are elk. And the computer learns the difference, and then you give it some new pictures, and you see how well it can separate those. That would be supervised learning. Or you can imagine genetics, the same idea with, here are pictures of people with Noonan syndrome, with this genetic change versus that genetic change. Can you tell those apart, right? You're labeling them, that's supervised. Unsupervised, you just throw all those pictures of moose and elk in the hopper, and you say, here computer, here's a bunch of pictures, see if you can separate them. And maybe it separates them as moose and elk, or maybe in some other way that's useful. That would be called unsupervised learning. As you can imagine, one of the advantages is that you don't have to spend tons of time labeling data, and it can actually work really powerfully with large, messy data sets. There are other kinds of machine learning, but for the sake of time, we'll stop there, but those are two of the main kinds. Now, the main reason you hear so much about AI these days, to the point where some folks are frankly sick of it, is deep learning. And deep learning is based on that stuff that Jeff Hinton and his colleagues figured out with these artificial neural networks that are patterned after the way the brain works. So the data is connecting in ways that maybe superficially seems like the way that neurons in our brain connect. That's called deep learning. And it's called deep because there are multiple layers of these connections, but there's no definition like how many layers you need to be deep. Just like there's not really a definition for deep genomic or exome sequencing, like at what point you get to call it deep, right? But it has to have some number of layers. So that's deep learning. And then generative AI, and this is where this picture kind of breaks down, just means you're making things, you're generating things, whether it's pictures or videos or music or words or whatever, and most of that depends on certain types of deep learning. So again, in my mind, there are three reasons why all this is possible, right? Why this is really taking off, other than the definitions of what I showed you. The reason number one is we have super powerful computers. So imagine how powerful the computers that you all have out in front of you or that you have in your pockets, right, are compared to what was available a couple of decades ago. This is our cutesily named high-performance computing instrument at NIH, BioWolf. These are intertwined reasons, by the way. Reason number two are these are the algorithms, or these are the methods behind these deep learning techniques. And I divide these into two different things. This is just a very simple schematic of that idea of a neural net, of that deep learning with multiple layers, right? It's kind of going, the layers are going sideways, not deep like you think about. But you put data in, maybe the input is pictures of moose and elk, and you get out, okay, these are moose, these are elk, and we'll talk a little bit about how that works under the hood. And those hidden layers are connections between those two, right? How the data are connecting, and again, we'll talk a little more about how that works. But that was like the Nobel Prize winning idea to make this happen. And a question I get a lot is, okay, you're talking about pictures a lot, but the point is you can do this with any kind of data, whether it's words or pictures or videos or sounds. You reduce to a mathematical representation, and that's what you're analyzing with these layers. The other thing, and this is just like a cartoon method of maybe some of the way these layers connect, are just the many different ways that the data are connecting to each other. And it's not mathematically or, I guess, philosophically intuitive what's going to make sense. So if you think your jobs are boring now, no matter what you do, imagine that your job is trying every single different possible combination, tweaking tiny little changes, right, to get to from 99.6 to 99.7 accuracy. And so you're a Google intern, and that's your life for years, is trying every little possible combination to try to get things to work as well as possible. Not as glamorous as this, but this is what gets you really, really high performance. And then the third thing, again, these are connected to just having lots of computers and having an internet, is we have lots of data sets. Whether it's everything people are putting into social media that might be used for training data, or this is an intentionally gathered training data set of lots of images of different types of skin cancer that you could use to train these models to be able to tell skin cancer apart, or any kind of question that you might want. So just as some examples in genetics of some early papers that my group did when I came to NIH a few years ago, this is just a simple thing where we trained from a few hundred images one of these deep learning methods to be able to tell apart different skin conditions, different genetic skin conditions, right? And it's not very hard to do this. What we're more interested in is how well does it perform when you have this nicely cropped image, right? Like here's the birthmark like you'd see in a textbook, versus the kind of picture that mom or dad might take of their kid and send to you as the clinician and say, I just noticed this birthmark on my kid, do you think they have a genetic condition, or what should I do next? It's also unsurprising, but kind of unfair. The computers are frankly better than geneticists and pediatricians, as we tested here, at doing this. Now, I think the natural response is, oh yeah, but when I'm, as a clinician, seeing this patient, I'm also going to ask about family history. I'm also going to ask, are there any neurodevelopmental findings and all the other things. But you can layer in those types of data as well, unfortunately, or not. So this is another study we did with folks at the National Eye Institute. And we had a couple hundred patients with different forms of genetic conditions that cause foveal hypoplasia, so it leads to poor vision. And so the way that ophthalmologists look at these folks' eyes and provide prognostic information is they do this special image called an OCT, which looks at the layers of the retina. And so from that, they can answer the questions that are important to the parents, which are usually things like, when my kid's a little older, will they be able to see well enough to ride a bike? When they're a teenager, will they be able to see well enough to drive a car? And so by grading it, by taking those images, they can do that. So we were interested, so we took these images and, unsurprisingly, we can build a classifier, that's what these deep learning models are called, that can do that pretty well. And then we tested how much it helps to have other clinical information, the type of clinician would take into account. How old is the patient? What's their eyesight at the time? Do they have nystagmus or rapid eye movement? And some of the things like that. And that helps a little bit. And again, our main goal here isn't to build an app or something like that. We're interested in how well do these methods work with the types of sparse data sets that we tend to have when we study genetics, right? Because these conditions tend to be relatively rare. But the point is here that you can layer in different types of information in these models. And I think something that's the most mind-blowing to me, this is from a paper we published a few months ago. I think, as some of you know, thanks to my colleague Bill Gall and the folks that work with him, for decades they've been studying alkaptonuria, which is an inborn error of metabolism. It causes all sorts of problems, including spinal changes, right? They give people bad neck pain and back pain. It causes cardiovascular complications. And as of, I think, literally a week or two ago, it's approved by the FDA, nitisinone, this medicine. It's been approved in Europe for a little longer. And the thought is that nitisinone, really the endpoint was, do these people need knee replacements? But the thought is that if you have nitisinone, will it be able to stave off some of these complications like this bad degenerative disc disease? And so, just out of curiosity, we only had a few hundred images, and so we tried to see if the computer, the model, could tell the difference between people on nitisinone or off nitisinone. And we controlled for all the variables, age and severity and all that. And humans can't do this. So a radiologist can't do this. We made sure that they couldn't. An expert biochemical geneticist who's very familiar with alkaptonuria can't tell. But the computer can tell pretty successfully if someone's on that medication or not. Again, not something a human can do. And what we did, and we'll come back to this later, we did these saliency maps. That the green is showing you what part of the picture is important to the computer when it's telling you, is that person on nitisinone or not? And we think, and this is just our intuition, the computer won't tell you this, but we think what it tends to highlight are areas where there's a lot of connective tissue or cartilage. So we think it's seeing the deposition of the pigment that is caused by alkaptonuria around, for example, the voice box. And in the lumbar x-rays, you see the same thing around the aorta. So we think it's seeing pigment deposition of the polymers caused by alkaptonuria there. So it's kind of an interesting thing that it can see these things when we can't. All right, so now let's pause again. This is kind of one of those long slides about how this works. And so you see all these things like, computers can, face the gene if you know that company, or computers can recognize people, or just like I told you, you can see this or that from an x-ray. So let's talk a little bit about how that works. So this would be your artificial neural network or your deep learning module, okay? And the task here is to take that picture of the vehicle and then to tell, is this a car, a truck, or a van? Or you could ask it to do something more specific. Is this a Prius, a Ford, a Tesla, whatever, right? You can determine by layering on more data, you can do that. So what it does is, let's see if I can figure out how to do this. So it's sliding across this square, across the image. That square is called a filter. And it's basically, if you remember that, that kid's book, Are You My Mother? It's basically asking, are you my mother, as it slides across? Do you look like me? Are your pixels similar to mine? It's actually doing this, without getting too complicated, in 3 dimensions, because it's taking into account color. But it's sliding across there. And at first, it's learning to recognize, the point is that you wouldn't do this with a car. You would do this, in this case, with a brain MRI of a child with a biochemical condition. And at first, let's just switch to faces because that'll make more sense. It's learning pretty simple things early on, like light from dark or edges from the middle of the picture. And then you're bringing together this information, right, with this neural net approach, and you're getting more complicated structures like the eyes and the nose and the mouth and things like that. And then you're bringing together in lighter layers all these features together, so now you're seeing different faces. And then you could imagine, you could say, okay, let's divide these faces, which are men, which are women, which are old, which are young, which is, I don't know, Noonan syndrome, Down syndrome, Kabuki syndrome, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? So that's a very simple version of how it works. So you're going from kind of these simple things to these more complex tasks, and you're telling it what to do by providing instructions and training data. So we've talked a lot about images. We'll shift gears a little bit now to words, and we know from ChatGPT and so on that these tools do really well. This is just, we took some questions from a board review book I had written for genetics, and this is just a diagram, and the point is that even with these early ChatGPT type models, they answer the questions really well, as we know. Of course, we also know they hallucinate and make things up and so on and so forth, but they perform pretty darn well. And we take this for granted now that you can do things like pass the USMLE, pass genetic counseling exams, pass the law exams, and do all these things that are pretty jaw-dropping. And I think it's amazing to pause and think that we don't blink at that anymore. Like, oh yeah, of course it can do that. It's just incredible. But it also leads to really scary statements like this from a couple months ago, from the end of March, where Bill Gates said, in 10 years, we're not going to have any of us anymore, right? Doctors and teachers. Now, I don't believe that. I think, and I'm not Bill Gates, but I don't believe that. I do think what we're going to be doing will be profoundly impacted by these systems, whether we like it or not, but I don't think we're going to be replaced. That's just me. But the analogy, and I think Anna's heard me say this, give this example before in some of this, is I think about it like if you've been to London, the London cab drivers and these big black classic, looking cabs. For many years, they had to take this test called the knowledge. They had to know all the streets, this really hard test, all the streets of London and all the ins and outs and so on and so forth. And even when GPS came along, they were still forced to take that test, right? And some could argue, I'm not saying which is right or wrong, but one might argue that maybe they should focus on other things instead of just memorizing the streets because they have GPS, which does really well. And I guess the way I like to think about it, but I don't know where this line is, but is the difference between forklifting and weightlifting. So if you work in a factory and you have these 100-pound boxes, you shouldn't probably spend your time trying to, I couldn't do it, but you shouldn't try to do it, like lifting these boxes around. For goodness sakes, use a forklift, right? And so again, going back to AI, tools that aren't fun to do, they're just brute work. For goodness sakes, use AI. I think the perfect example, and I don't know if there's any folks that will hate me saying this, but it's prior authorizations in medicine, right? That's like a perfect forklifting example. Weightlifting is the things that might be enjoyable or might be fun or you want to learn and that you still want to do, and as a human that you should learn to do. For me, it's not a genetics example, but I love reading, right? I like reading fiction, and I wouldn't want to read just a one-paragraph AI-generated blurb of some great fiction work, right? So I think of that as weightlifting. Or you just again like doing it. And this doesn't necessarily tell you what's forklifting and what's weightlifting, but I think it's an interesting schema. This makes me really sad because I think maybe some of us could argue that this is forklifting. This is why I got into genetics, is being able to see the child with terms that nobody else heard of, and I like the fact that I knew these big words and nobody else didn't, and I could think of this test that nobody else knew about to do for this child. But maybe more of this is forklifting because of these AI tools that can do things like pass the genetics boards and so on. And I heard in a talk yesterday, and I think this really connects to it, this idea, for lots of reasons, of moving genetics more towards management of patients. And I think this AI piece of it is a very strong argument because AI is really darn good at doing these things. And so I think we do need to change before we become extinct or replaced, or while we still have it in our hands to control it the way that we want. One thing that I think is really funny or not funny is that one of the things that AI still can't do is humor at all. So I told the program, I said, make a cartoon about dinosaur extinction and make it really funny. And this is what I came up with, which is, I think it's very funny how unbelievably unfunny it is. And some other weird things, like there's this weird double dinosaur there. So anyway, let me check. Let me check time. Okay, good. But I think there's some interesting things, with the forklifting and weightlifting idea that I use all the time. So I have a very smart colleague that works on, pangenome bioinformatics and stuff, frankly, that's way over my head. I don't get it. But when he published his paper, I put it into one of these tools and I asked one of these large language models, can you explain this to me? And nope, dumb it down a little bit, can you explain it again? I think some of that is super helpful. We also know there's many different learning types, so there are tools, for example, where you can upload that same paper and it'll make, and probably some of you are aware of this, it can make you an audio guide to it. It can make you a podcast that's based on that. And so for educational purposes, I'm playing around with that with a lot of our trainees at NIH and seeing if this works. And I think there are interesting ways to get at different learning types. We've also been playing with other ways to use AI for training and education around genetics. So these are fake generated images of people with Kabuki syndrome, not real Kabuki syndrome. We had also been working with generated, not real images showing the progression, in this case, of the back of someone with NF1. And one of the computer scientists in my group, I don't know why he did this, but he came up with this thing where he took generated, not real people, and then he morphed them by degrees, so 25%, 50%, 75%, and then 100%, and I know you can't see this, but those are people with Noonan syndrome, generated images. And it seems really silly and weird, because obviously that doesn't happen, but our trainees said, oh, that's actually a really helpful thing to be able to help them see, like, oh yeah, that's what's recognizable about Noonan syndrome. And we did a study where we took about a couple hundred pediatric residents, and they said, oh yeah, it turned out that these were actually just as helpful training them to recognize these conditions. But they did say they knew which ones were real and which ones were generated, and they preferred the real images. So for whatever reason, they were biased against AI, which is okay. There's lots of interesting things to think about. This is a book, if folks are interested in kind of the educational aspects of using AI for lots of reasons. Ethan Mollick is a professor of business, I guess, at Wharton in Pennsylvania, and he does these things like these impossible tasks he assigned to his class. He says, okay, you have access to AI, these tools, right? These large language models, ChatGPT, Gemini, whatever. Do something impossible with them, right? Make a website that can actually do something really hard and functional, and I cannot design a website on my own, and I was able to design a really crappy one that could actually do some stuff. I would never share it with anybody, but it's really enjoyable. It's my definition of enjoyable. But it's really fascinating to see what you can do with these tools now that they're available. All right, so let's shift gears now. I always change these for different talks I do, but I want to talk about 3 myths about AI in medicine at this point. So someone yell out if you recognize what this myth is, just to, again, keep you awake. Not that you should know this. Anybody recognize this one? These are all kind of hard. I don't know if anybody. So this one, I think this is Persephone and Hades, and I think it's supposed to be, if anybody remembers that story. All right, so myth 1 is that just having these amazing tools, or very powerful, accurate models is going to be a good thing in medicine. If you just plunk them down, and that, as you can probably imagine, since most of you are clinicians or clinically related, that doesn't happen, right? So this was a study that was done, it was published a few years ago, where they had this AI system that was really good at telling if someone from a slide had liver cancer or not. And so they gave this tool to pathologists, and they said, here's this tool, it's really accurate, and it's going to help you figure out if someone has liver cancer or not. So it turns out that when they did that, it didn't help at all. Because basically, the people were really intimidated, that's my interpretation, they were so intimidated by the system that even if they clearly knew what the answer was, they would defer to it. And the AI system was very accurate, but sometimes it just makes mistakes, right? It'll something that's very obviously not liver cancer, it'll label liver cancer and vice versa. But the people were always, the pathologists were always second guessing what they knew because they were intimidated by this and actually made things much worse. Myth 2, anybody recognize this one? You're focused on this guy. I don't know. Hades Town, that's a guesses? So this is Orpheus in Eurydice? Okay, anyway. So myth 2 is that this idea, this has been published, that clinicians who use AI are going to replace clinicians who don't. So this was a study, and there are multiple studies that have been meta-analyses now that have shown the same thing. This came out about a year ago, where they did all these clinical vignettes, and they gave them to doctors and residents, and they said, based on this vignette, this written description of a patient, what's a diagnosis and what would you do, basically? And the 2 arms of this study were, you get to use an AI chatbot, like ChatGPT or something, or you can use what they call conventional resources, like UpToDate and Google and things like that. And people were actually, it was pretty similar. It didn't really make a difference, one or the other. But when they just fed the answers, sadly, to ChatGPT alone in this case, it did way better than either of those 2 arms, right? So it's not just that you just need to give people access to these tools and that's going to necessarily help. But Here's what I think is very reassuring, at least for now, but maybe not, this won't last. This is from a study that we did that we published about a year ago, where we took about, I can't remember exactly, about 60 or so different descriptions of medical conditions, genetic conditions. And we saw how well all these different large language models, all these different AI tools could recognize them. And so, as you can imagine, the bigger models with more training data do better, right? But these are all fake, made-up, kind of curated descriptions of, like, you know, the average patient or what you would expect. And then we went to real patients with genetic conditions, and we said, okay, just write a paragraph about yourself. These were diagnosed patients, and describe what you have, and let's see how well we recognize. And that's here in like this kind of salmon color. And you can see all of a sudden, even with these very simple, short descriptions, the computer has a really hard time dealing, or the AI system, with real life. And in dark blue above there, those are like the hypothetical patients, right? With kind of like, with like a curated kind of thing that you might see in a professional vignette or on a board exam or in the New England Journal or whatever else, right? So there's still a big gap in which the models have a hard time with the complexity of real life. We're studying that more. All right, last myth to try to guess. This is almost impossible, so if anybody gets that, this is Arachne, so I think this is what she's weaving before she gets turned to a spider by the jealous goddess. So the third thing is, okay, maybe these systems are so good, maybe these models are so good that, but what humans are really good at is talking to patients, to counseling, to helping humans with the human-to-human interaction. And I think that's true, but I think this gives us food for thought. So they took a bunch of questions, medical questions that were posted to Reddit on a kind of a physician, whatever it's called, Reddit channel. And this was something monitored by physicians, and so people would say, oh, I have this rash and it's pain in my ear, what should I do? And they looked at the physician responses and they compared those to a large language model responses, and they found that the large language model was A, more accurate, and B, sadly, more empathetic. So maybe that's not surprising if you've been to a clinician lately and think that they're just sitting at their computer. But anyway, so I think it does, maybe it challenges some of us to do better. And obviously this is a very specific, just looking at Reddit responses, on a computer versus a real interaction, but it is interesting. All right, so for the last part, and hopefully I'll leave time for plenty of discussion. Yes, okay, good. I want to talk a little bit about explainable AI, just because I think it's an interesting area. So I got especially interested in this during COVID, mostly because I was stuck in my room, dealing with my kids and not doing anything else. But this paper came out, and this was a paper where they were looking at chest x-rays to see if someone had COVID or not. And if you remember, hopefully you don't, but if you remember during COVID, early in the pandemic, it would take days or weeks, or it's almost impossible to get results, right, from a lab test. So if someone came in with COVID-like symptoms, you'd want to know from their x-ray to take proper care of them if they had COVID or not. And they developed a deep learning model, just like I talked about, in the same ways. And it worked really well, worked better than doctors and radiologists and ER docs, et cetera, et cetera. But when they did these saliency maps, so they saw what part of the image is important to the computer model, it wasn't even looking in the lungs. It was looking outside of the lung fields, and it was doing things like looking at, are there lines in place for these people? Are they positioned a certain way? Because that was associated with COVID. So these models will cheat, right? Or will take cheating is not wrong, but they'll take shortcuts. You have to be very careful about what you're doing, because the way it's trained, and whether it's trained in this hospital system or that hospital system or whatever, it's not necessarily going to look at what you as a human might think is important. My group works on kind of similar stuff applied to genetics. This was a paper from last year, and we're just looking at this point, saying what's important to a model, when in this case diagnosing at the top, this is deletion 22q, the bottom this is Kabuki syndrome, versus a clinician that can recognize these. And the point is not that one's better than the other or something like that, but if there are circumstances where humans are way better than computers, whether it's certain conditions or ages of patients or patients from different parts of the world, or where the computer's better, that's a good way to figure out which part we need to augment to help diagnose patients. I think another natural question is, okay, that's fine, but we have apps now. I mentioned one. Why would we even bother to know the difference of this? I think part of it is what I told you. And then part of it, this is from a preprint that's still under review, like a year and a half later, but with this big consortium of folks looking at lots of different images of patients, you can see that these models are much better at certain populations than others. right? So these models will work really well sometimes, especially when they have lots of trained data, but really much less well in other circumstances, some of which are predictable and some of which are not. So it's really important to know kind of where they work, where they don't work, et cetera, et cetera. But not to let us humans off the hook, I think there are lots of clinical parallels to this. So when I was a pediatric resident, I was training at this hospital. This is Holy Cross Hospital up north of DC, and that's where we did newborn nursery. Just took care of a ton of babies. And there were terrific pediatric attendings there, and they said, years ago, decades ago, they felt very comfortable as kind of amateur dysmorphologists knowing who should get a genetics consult and who shouldn't. They would have to call downtown to get that, so they wanted to be sure that they had good judgment around that. But about 10 years before that, there had been this giant wave of patients coming from Central America up to that region because of all the unrest in Central America, countries like El Salvador. And so many of these patients settled around here. And all of a sudden, the geneticists realized that, wow, we are really not feel very confident about knowing if this person has a genetic condition or not, And it's not that they all of a sudden, lost their minds, they just hadn't learned what these genetic conditions looked like in different populations, right? So the point is that I think we rightly slam these models for bias and problems like that. We should rightly slam ourselves and look at ourselves with the same careful eye to make sure that we're able to diagnose patients from different populations and in different scenarios equally well. There are, for the sake of time, I won't go over this, but there are analogous things with large language models where we try to understand why they're doing what they're doing. And I want to end, or almost end, with 3 pieces of advice, if that's okay. So one is that I think in genetics, we tend to be okay with that, but we do have to remember that things change a lot. And again, as geneticists, things have changed dramatically in the last 10 or 20 years with the sequencing techniques and gene therapy and the different things that are coming along and changing our practice. And this is another one of those. I would say, even if you don't like it, it's a good thing to get to know AI and practice using it, get to know the models. Or for some of us like me, get your kid to change the settings on your phone, that kind of thing. But familiarity can be very helpful. And then again, like I talked about in that last slide, remember the tools are amazing, they're really cool, but they're not perfect. So I'm not saying you shouldn't use them. I think I do use them, but use them kind of smartly and circumspectly and think about what they can do and what they maybe can't do so well. One thing I do want to say, and this is just a blatant advertisement for an IRB research study that we have, is we are trying to get in touch with patients who have diagnosed genetic conditions. So they have condition X, Y, or Z, and we're basically doing virtual versions of H&Ps with them, of clinician visits. It's a genetic counselor and a physician talks to them, because we're trying to get from like a full H&P, well not really the P so much, but from the full medical history, what happens when the model is looking at that data verbatim from a patient's mouth versus what might be nicely typed up in a medical journal. And with that, thank you, and thank you especially my group and the people in red are the trainees who should get the most shout outs. So thank you. I think I left a little bit of time I didn't go over, right? So,
Got about 8 minutes.
Oh, perfect. All right, good.
You're great.
Questions?
If you don't have questions about this.
Thank you for the wonderful talk. For the study you were talking about with the different populations, with a little bit that I have played with Face2Gene, I don't know if that was what it was used, and I don't know if that's what I learned was correct or not. I always heard that as more people use and upload more pictures, the model learns better. So was it because for those populations they were not getting pictures and uploads, or was it something else?
Yeah, so it's a great question, and let me explain it in kind of, I'll try to be quick, but semi-nauseating detail. So it was with kind of an academic offshoot of Face2Gene, so it wasn't that app, but it was with the German group that does a lot with the Gestalt matcher, of which, for full transparency, I'm part of that group that oversees that. So the most basic thing is what you say is correct. If the model hasn't seen very much of a certain thing, it's not going to do well. That certain thing can be a certain condition, or it can be maybe that certain condition in younger people or older people, or from this part of the world or that part of the world. The more data it gets, the better. And you can, but part of it is that's kind of a simple and clear explanation, like you just need more data is better. But what's really interesting is that when you understand, when you dive down, you see where it works and what doesn't. Let's say it's just really hard, you can't get, there's only 10 of this X in the world, right? Like we could say all we want, we need more data, but it's not going to happen, right? So there are some kind of clever computational ways you can augment data or overweight certain type of data to boost the performance in the areas where it's not working well. You have to be careful about it because you can do what's called overfitting. But there are some clever ways that you can boost performance in ways if you know where it's working and where it doesn't work. Does that make sense?
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you.
Thanks.
Do you feel like face-to-gene has gotten better over the years?
So there's a couple different things about that. So number one, with more data, it tends to get better, right? Number two is that like any tool, you need good IT support. And so I would say that the amount of really boring IT support matters for how well face-to-gene works, you know, in addition to just, you know, how much data is in there. And then the other thing, and this makes it really hard, and that makes me glad I just do boring research and don't actually try to do something, you know, more useful than that, is that the models are constantly changing. So there's all these different deep learning models, and some of them are better than others. And it's really hard to take the data on an older model, right, and transfer it to a new model that's better, right, that might work a little bit better. So I think there's many different stages, but yet overall it is getting better, in my opinion. Though I haven't seen kind of a vigorous, it'd be hard to do a vigorous test over time, but yeah. But these models definitely are getting better overall.
Hey, Alex Davis, University of Florida, Jacksonville. This might not be a fair question, and I'm sorry, but do you think it's possible to fully integrate AI into our clinics, or is it something that we're kind of piecemealing, like we're using face-to-gene to help us with our physical exam? Is there a way, or have you thought of possible to get AI just in every point?
Yeah. So I think there's lots of, I think anything's possible. I think there's lots of reasons I don't think it's going to happen, like as in one just boom, you know, here's your AI, and then there you go. I think it'll happen in very piecemeal ways. I think for a variety of reasons. One is that, so my wife, just for full disclosure, works for Kaiser. You know, they're very careful and thoughtful. She's not a geneticist, and man, they're implementing things very quickly, but they're doing it kind of one module or piece at a time. For example, the ambient AI, you know, that listens and writes notes for you, and then AI that helps maybe the radiologist diagnose certain things, right? Not everything, but certain things, and so they're doing it. And I think it's going to be implemented like that for several reasons. One is that you want evidence that it works and it actually helps and doesn't, like that pathologist, actually make things worse. That's number one. Number two is we know for some reasons that are good and some reasons maybe not so good, healthcare changes slowly despite what we're saying. And a lot of it has to do with the regulatory aspects of this. And right now, the regulatory aspects of AI, whether it's coming from the FDA or other regulatory bodies in other countries, it's really unclear how it's overall going to be managed. And it's been unclear for a while. I'm not saying all of a sudden things are, I mean, it's always been unclear what the best regulatory framework and what to do with that. So I think there's a lot of kinks that have to be worked out of the system to be able to handle this well. And I think it'll be very challenging. But what I do not expect that, you know, you're going to come in tomorrow or 3 years from now and someone's going to say, boom, here's your system, use everything. But there's little chunks, you know, for example, there's a neat paper that came out in Stanford where they were in their EHR, they've embedded some of these AI tools that can help look at their medical records and look at and answer certain questions for them about patients' history. So it'll be very piecemeal, I think. And maybe it should be.
So Stanford, Yale, a couple of other universities have decided that they would use sort of a custom AI tool where they upload guidelines and best practices instead of general ChatGPT. Do you happen to know if that is better, in air quotes, better predictive, or if there's caution versus the workload to do such?
Yeah, so there's a lot of methods. So if you take one of these giant, just general purpose large language models, you know, like all the ones that are available, and what these ones are called kind of open source or open weight, like the Llama models or the Tuna models, you know, they do tend to work pretty well. There's a ton of research going into what you talked about, and one version of it is called retrieval augmented generation rate, which is the idea that you take a general purpose large language model, you give it a bunch of rules, right? Or give a bunch of data that are very clearly labeled, and you see if it'll, and they tend to work better, but not always, right? And sometimes actually adding some of that data makes things work worse and overfits, or it makes it work better in one area and not the other area. So I would say yes, there's a lot of promise for doing that, but we're still, you know, very early in the game, and kind of the overall implementation of how well that works, in my mind, is very promising, but there's a ton of questions about it. Yeah. Right.
So, can you think of two things that you would recommend to me as someone who has never used AI as a clinical geneticist that I should do? Like, tell me 2 experiments I should do or steps I should take.
Okay. Yeah. Okay, so I would tell you, here are 2, okay? One is I would put in some clinical scenarios, depending, because they're constantly changing the rules, but I would pick a large language model like Open Evidence or something like that, and just pick some clinical scenarios and say, let's say I'm seeing a 10-year-old girl with autism and XYZ and this and that, and ask some questions, right? And see what the answers are like, and just as importantly, see what the evidence is, what it's citing, what you can get to. And you'll find some things that are very impressive, and I wouldn't be surprised if you find some things where you say, oh my gosh, that is dumb and wrong, right? And so finding that balance, I think, is very helpful. So I would say that's number 1, is use them and test them in some like kind of clinical scenarios. Number 2, which I think is very fascinating, is that there are these like research modes where you can give it the most esoteric question, right? I'm gonna go back to my friend Bill Gall. You can ask it, write me a very well-documented academic research paper about the history of nitisinone use in alkaptonuria, right? And it'll write you a 20-page paper, review paper on that topic, and look at it and see what's good about it and what's bad about it and what's kind of might be very superficial to the level that could be helpful to one of your medical students, but if you're trying to talk to your peers, may or may not be helpful. So those would be, I think, the 2 things that I would do in terms of this area that I'm talking about, right? And otherwise, I think I like making dopey pictures of them.
Thank you for being fearless when it comes to AI, because it's been around, again, over 50 years or more. But at the same time, we've always been taught, don't use augmented, don't use this and don't use that. But we do have to engage in it in order to be able to know the difference between what's real and what's not. At the same time, I do so agree, as we have put in all the language for the AI, but then if you go in and you look your own, you go and do the research yourself and give it 5 scholarly articles, and you ask AI to do this and you compare the 2, it's totally different, because AI is going to try to pixelate, and you'll get a lot of wiki stuff and different other things. But it's doing what you asked it to do, but you turn it in reverse, and so always measure both sides of it, in order to be able to know what's valid and what's not. Thank you.
I'll leave it at that. I totally agree, though. Okay, thank you.
Thanks so much, Ben. This has been really fun. Okay, well, we'll move along here.